afternoon and welcome to this edition of Expert Speak. As we are negotiating through the COVID times, the role of gender equity and the role of women in negotiating through these tough times is extremely important and probably something that needs to be given more emphasis in the public narrative that we have on COVID. Today, I'm very pleased to have Nandita Baruah as the country representative of the Asia Foundation in India to talk about this, responding to the COVID crisis, the importance of gender equity. Nandita, welcome to this edition of Expert Speak. So glad to have you. With more than 25 years of professional experience on working on gender, human rights, labor, migration, and human trafficking issues in South and Southeast Asia. Nandita has extensive experience in the field. She's worked in India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Nepal. Nandita has headed the South Asia Regional Program on gender-based violence, human trafficking and migration and rural development. She's worked to support national governments and civil society partners to design and deliver programs that effectively address the core socio-economic and political dimensions of development through a rights and gender equitable framework. In her role at Asia Foundation, which has a footprint on over 18 countries, she continues in this mission. Prior to that, she's worked as gender advisor to SIDA. She was the South Asia Regional Gender Fund Manager. She was the regional coordinator for the UN Women Anti-Trafficking Program, and she served with USAID India as the regional anti-trafficking and gender specialist. So we are very, very pleased to have you, Nandita, on this edition of Expert Speak. I would like to start by asking you that do you think there is enough of a women's perspective in the policies made in the process of negotiating through and the recovery process while we are in these COVID times? And where do you see the gaps that are there and what can be done to fill them up? If you can make a general, lay out a general idea for all of us, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sabyasachi, and thanks to Asian Confluence for really hosting me on this platform. I think it's also interesting that, when you talk about how much of a gender lens do we have in relation to COVID, I would like to put it in perspective that a gender lens has been largely missing in most policy perspective. It's not something that has been mainstreamed as much as one would want it to, and one would think it to be necessary. And the absence is not so much because of lack of policy. I think in most of the cases, if you look at a pre-COVID scenario, we have fairly robust frameworks where we have said, there has to be equitable participation of men and women. There are, positive reservation-related issues being placed so that women can be more equitably engaged in every sphere. However, I think when we actually look at the policy framework and we look at, say, the legal framework, where the gap lies is how much of that is actually translatable in relation to the very, very inherent, deeply seated patriarchal socioeconomic structure within which we all operate, And that's never an easy reach, because when we talk about we operate within patriarchy, it means that men and women and people in power ascribe to certain beliefs within that construct. And in that construct of belief, women don't necessarily have a central role, right? So when we look at that reality, which is pre-COVID, it is only understandable and probably, I guess, almost like bound to happen, that women's voices, women's needs, and women's differential impact on both health and socioeconomic aspect because of a pandemic or a humanitarian disaster like COVID does not get adequately reflected. It's not like the construct pre-COVID has suddenly changed and everything has become more inclusive or equitable. Now, how do we see this playing out? Let's just say that one of the critical issue that this pandemic has brought in front of us is that the one way of handling this pandemic and globally is isolation, right? Social distancing, not mingling, keeping your distance, keeping inside the perimeter of your house. And that's something that's been universally adapted all over the world to deal with the health hazards of this pandemic. If you are to take a step back and say, okay, yes, we agree that's important, but how does that isolation, how does that stay-at-home order impact women? And that's where the stark difference in how it impacts men and women comes into place. On one hand, there's a reality that globally, violence in private spaces, be it domestic violence or intimate partner violence, is an inherent reality in all parts of the world, everywhere, globally. And therefore, we have a lot of cases of domestic violence, femicide, you name it. When women are therefore forced into private spaces which are constrained with people who are their existing or potential perpetrators, what that does is it puts women at greater risk. So what isolation did, and we've seen this globally, we've seen this coming out of France, we've seen this coming out of Russia, we've seen this in India, is that women, the incidences of violence that women had to deal with increased quite a bit when women were forced into this isolation, where they were forced to stay in confined spaces with their existing or potential perpetrators. It also has another issue that I think we need to keep in mind. This pandemic has created a serious, emotional, mental stress and crisis for everybody. In the existing norms of patriarchy, what that crisis has also done is that men are equally feeling the burden of this crisis. Men are in a position where they're losing their economic ability to support families or their jobs or whatever, and their liberty to move out freely, and therefore are pushed into these confined spaces, which they're not used to dealing with. And as a result, there is also a lot of reaction saying that, okay, if you're unable to do it, how do you express your anger, your angst, your anxiety? And that's getting also translated into violence. And in patriarchy, that violence is accepted because, men generally get away by being violent with women. And women take it not because they think this is right, because it's also they have no recourse. And that recourse has become less and less because you're unable to go out, even seek help. You're unable to go out and seek shelter because there is an isolation order that's out there. There's it's a policy directive that governments have adopted. The other challenge is that we, across the, world and in South Asia largely, the investments on the kind of infrastructure that women need, even in non-pandemic times, to be able to be adequately protected from violence, sexual abuse, have always been limited, whether it is shelter home, whether it's resources in hospitals, whether it's medical, they've always been limited. And there, the women's movement have been asking for years about increasing this investment. Now, that lack of investment meant that many, globally across the world, across South Asia, many organizations and institutions which are there to support women in the case of violence and DVB, did not have the adequate resources to take on this additional burden. So in the 50, 60 days of lockout or 3 months of lockout that we have seen in the world, what did we see? We saw a lot of investment governments did and used this lockout period to enhance the capacity of our healthcare globally, right? Increase beds, PEs, ICUs. But nobody for a moment thought that, wait a minute, we may need to also enhance shelter and secure facilities for women who may need it. it was not in the thinking. There was no thinking saying, what will this isolation do to women? What will this lockdown do to women? Will putting women inside houses have some kind of an impact which is going to be manifested in greater vulnerability or increase the level of violence or exploitation they face? That thinking was absent. That thinking should not have been absent. And because that was absent, we invested a lot in other things. We didn't for a moment think that we might actually increase the capacity of the shelter homes to shelter women if they face this violence in the coming months. We didn't think that. So I think to me, that absence reflects the absence of a gender lens, as I would say in policy framing. The other thing is we targeted a lot of our resources, I guess rightly so. I mean, it's also almost like, your entire law enforcement agency was pushed into handling the exigencies arising out of COVID, right? So even there was a big gap in going to a police station to report. Were there even enough people, staff who were there to whom a woman could go in the event if she made it there in the first place? So recording of violence is also got reduced because everybody's focus became the health and the larger pandemic that we were dealing with. So I think these are, to me, have been major challenges. And I think there has been a lot of writing, there have been some articles, there have been media reports, but I just feel that they've just been very, let's kind of report this case and one off. They haven't been very solution driven.
Honestly, thank you very much for spelling it all out, because I think even people like us, who we are constantly reading, talking, you're so right that it's been cases reported, but it hasn't captured the seriousness of the situation. The gap has really not been addressed, it's not even in the narrative right now, and the kind of violence issues that that you alluded to, I'm sure that creates a whole new different level of stress in the house, in the community, because somehow before the pandemic, there were some ways, maybe some outlets they could vent out, but now with this social isolation, it's become more difficult. So which brings me to my next sort of question to you, which is, we're talking about, though the curve really hasn't flattened and we really don't know where we are going, it seems, yet, at least in our part of the globe. But economic recovery, dealing with the economic fallouts has been very much, in the central now, what everybody's thinking of. And here again, the role of the woman, the role of gender equity would be so very important, because whether it's in the fields of wherever it is, in the workplace or in the rural areas, can you share your perspectives on how in this recovery process, is there any way that more women empowerment could be done? What are the keys to economic recovery, especially from a gender perspective, in these times? And I would request you to take a South Asian viewpoint, maybe in our part of the globe, essentially, where we are, India and Bangladesh and Nepal and this part of the world. Yeah.
I think it's a very important question, and it's a question that needs to be addressed really seriously. Two things, we are all in a very difficult economic situation, and I think everybody accepts that while the health hazard and the impact on human health and quality of life from a health and well-being perspective is dire, the perspective from an economic well-being is no less dire, right? Because it's been a fallout of the fact that we have had to pull out our entire workforce. Now, within that workforce that we are looking at, who is critical to economic recovery, if we are to look at where women are situated, within that workforce, and start working from there. So If you're looking at, say, the rural economy, you will find that a lot of women in the rural sector are at the lower end of the agricultural sector work, right? But that's also one of the most labor intensive part of the activity. Now, we are looking at an economic recovery, say, from the agricultural side sector work. The question would be that in the event of lockdown, a couple of things also have happened. You cannot isolate the women from the home, right? Even in an economic sphere, because it's very connected. So we have a rural household. Let's just take an example. There are two women, three men, one adult man, two maybe adult women, and three children. Now, in a general scenario, most of those children would be going to the school in the morning, or to college, or to an educational institute, whatever doing, and the woman would probably do the cleaning, cooking with hopefully some help from the man, but maybe not. And then she would go to the farm. The current scenario is she has today to think about the fact that those children have to be at home. They're not going anywhere. So there's an added burden of caregiving that she has for her family, where she can't send those children out. She has to make sure that they are at home, take care of them. She also has to, at the same time, go back and do the usual work that she was doing in the agriculture. Now, she's also probably doubly burdened because there has been a labor exodus. So there's a lack of labor, and a lot of what might have been shared by one or two more people now would solely fall on her, whether it's in the household or it's in the field. The same thing gets translated in the urban sector as well. So the women's economic role as it is, she was most of the time the women, a majority of the women have not been in the higher end of the economic spectrum. They have been in the middle or lower end of the economic spectrum, and it's been growing. They are now burdened with having to make a choice between going back to an economic activity or staying at home and continuing to take care of the caregiving role and responsibility, which has now increased because there's a percentage of population in our family who cannot go out to do the usual stuff that they were doing. Okay. And so when that choice is put in face of a family or a community, which is steeped in basic patriarchal norm, which is South Asia, let's just say, then clearly the choice is not going to be made in saying, no, woman, you go and work, man, I will stay at home, look after the household. No. The choice will be made saying, women, you stay at home and go out to work also if you can, but otherwise, no. And I will go out to work and take on the role. So even in the recovery processes, women at the lower and middle segment of the economy are going to be left out in being able to take those opportunities, just from a family and social point of view. From an overall operational structural point of view, there are a lot of demands being put in the industry, right? You're saying you can bring back 50% of your staff, but you have to pick them up, you have to drop them. These are all security measures so that they don't infect, they don't get infected, they don't bring the thing in. You have to keep them on site. You can't let them go out. Now, to do all of this, unless you have very, very well-defined gender systems in place, women will not come back. Do you have separate toilets for women? Are there separate buses to bring back and take back women? Is she protected in the site? Does she have a place to stay where she thinks it's safe? Is it going to be a place where she doesn't have to worry about being abused and violated by other men? If an answer to all of this are no, even for the 50% or 70% who are going to go back to work, despite the industry not saying that I'm going to only choose men will automatically get a first preference to go in there because they don't have to worry about all the other aspects that a woman has to. Unless industry chooses and says, no, I want to make sure that 50% of those 75 or 50% who come back are men and women. Therefore, I'm going to make an additional investment to ensure that women come back. Women will not be able to take up that job. Now, will industry make that investment? I don't know. The industry is already suffered. Unless there is a package, there's a policy directive which says, if you incentivize working modalities for women, we will provide you certain larger industrial incentives. They will not do it. If I'm running an industry and I feel bringing women back will cost me 10% more in my investment than bringing men back, I'm already suffering. So I'm not going to add that 10% unless the government or the system incentivizes me to put that additional 10% to create the infrastructure for women to come back. Yes. So that's one scenario in the factory. The other one is, in many parts of urban India, one of the things we had noticed is that the gig economy had taken a big jump, and the aggregator platforms which were out there, say, the urban clap or the urban companies or, Swiggies or Amazons or whatever name it. The percentage of women employed in this had really increased. There are studies which point to between 40 to 50, even 60% in some cases. And this was also because many women in the urban, semi-urban, tier 1, tier 2 cities were preferring this platform because it gave them flexibility, it gave them their own time. They didn't have to, they could manage home and work, which is unfortunate, but they could manage home and work. And so they chose these areas. The downside is that the majority of the women who were in these aggregator platforms were in sectors where close contact with people was necessary. So they were either in personal grooming, they were in cleaning services, they were in personal trainers or fitness services. Now, with the pandemic, with the lockdown, these are the 3 services which were the first to be struck out of the list and are yet to come back, right? So a huge percentage of women who had in the last 5 to 8 years taken into the economic system through these, new ways of working are now again fallen off the economic ladder. And there hasn't been enough done to say, are there ways in which they can be re-employed in more mainstream sectors? Can we provide some skills and trainings to bring women back into this? Because it's going to be a while before you get your, personal grooming, your masseurs back into your house with confidence. It's not to say that the platforms are not trying. They're really trying to, Urban Company or whatever, some of these platforms are really trying to gain back confidence. But it is not just an individual company or company's responsibility. It is an overall thinking that has to be laid out, saying gig economy is a reality, gig economy has women. Therefore, if we want more women to engage in gig economy and continue to do their work, what is it that we as a economic policy and an economic system need to have in place? That thinking has not happened. That's all the higher level. Even working from home, and I have to tell you that even for an organization like us, we have a lot of female staff, I think, across the world, in all over Asia. The challenge has been that, when a woman works from home, it's almost like, oh, you're at home, so also you'll also cook, right? Because of course you don't have household help anymore. You'll also look after the child. When a man is working from home, the expectation is, oh, yeah, he's working. And so a lot of people, even in sectors like ours, felt doubly stressed even with this work from home, because there was an implicit expectation that you are also working. You are not working from home. Okay. And so you need to continue to do the other things that are required, because right now we don't have the other people who are helping us. So it's your responsibility. So I think these are also very deeply ingrained mindset issues on which there hasn't been a discourse, and a push to say, how do you engage at even this very, very, specific personal space and the public space and the industrial and the economic space. So these discourses have not picked up. There are murmurs, and this is really, it's really unfortunate that we haven't invested to say, let's talk more about how we can do this. Let's kind of have a webinar to bring industry people to say, what can you do to bring 50% of women who are critical to our workforce back into your industry? What can we do to help you incentivize that? So the choice automatically is that, not because by design, by default, it's the men who will pick up that. So I think that unless we do some of this, the percentage of women in the workforce at every level will dip at this point.
You are so right. And as I hear you, it strikes me so hard that it's at every rung of our society, whether it's in the rural areas, whether it's in the urban areas, even the affluent, middle urban, middle class, semi-affluent middle class. This is becoming an issue. And you so rightly said about the narrative is not there. The conversation is really not happening on how do you bring, how do you address this? So I'm going to ask you a difficult question, which is, where do you think, how do you think this conversation can be started more? You talked about a webinar with, example of a webinar with, the industry, for example, but it has to also percolate down from a policy level, I think. I mean, how do we start in, building an ecosystem where this conversation even takes place?
I think, it's critical. Like you said, I mean, this was a conversation not just post-COVID. It was a conversation pre-COVID. It has a conversation that has to happen during this period of COVID. It's a conversation that has to happen in the long run post-COVID. So let's just kind of think about what do governments do to incentivize women, right? So for example, if a woman takes a loan, there's a certain percentage of reduction in the interest rate that you get to do if you're buying a house or a second house, right? If a women, and their government incentivizes women and young girls and, adults, and to go to colleges and universities by giving you scholarships and stuff like that, right? You need to look beyond and say, when a woman goes to work, what do you need to do to incentivize it? So from a policy level, it has to be thought at saying, where are the women in the workforce? In that workforce, who are the people in the ecosystem of the workforce? It's the industries, the agricultural sector, rural development, government, civil society organization. So within that ambit of stakeholders, what is it that is needed for each of this category to be able to function in an inclusive manner to bring in women? Okay. Now, if we have, we've given massive recovery packages, stimulus packages, it would be really good to have clear directives on saying the stimulus packages will incentivize companies which bring in more women. The stimulus package will further incentivize a women entrepreneur if she wants to start something of her own. And what kind of interest rate rebates or technical skills or collaborations can the government and the system provide? Clearly stating those will be important. Through and saying, in all of our stimulus packages at different levels, be it in taxation, be it in small enterprise, be it for startups, where is the gender lens? And if it is there, can we strengthen it? If it is not there, can we input it? Are we therefore going to be able to say, for all the startup related stimulus package that the government has announced, say in India, is there some kind of a definitive directive which says any startup which has got a female investment partner will get a certain benefit? Any startup which is a startup by a woman will get additional benefit. Any startup which shows that it can actually benefit women in the kind of work they do will be incentivized, or which can employ more women will be incentivized. Unless we do that, I think this is an opportunity for us. We are trying to rejig our economy. This really is a window of opportunity for us to rejig our economy by definitively, inserting the gender lens into every sphere of economic recovery that we are doing. And we will have to unpack that and go. And I think unless we do that, I think it's going to be worse. We are not just going to be go back to where we were. We will also be, probably worse off than where we were.
You very rightly said that it was the issue pre-COVID. It is the issue during the pandemic, and it unfortunately seems to be going to continue as an issue after the pandemic. But I think also that the pandemic has really exaggerated the situation, because prior to the pandemic, at least, by their own sheer grit and determination, and some of the platforms and there was some way where women were coming into the workforce, as you saw, like the urban claps of the world. And those avenues are totally shut off now. So it seems that the situation is grimmer now. And you very rightly said, we've sort of gone back a few steps. How do you see in the current, environment in policy making? Do you think that there is a recognition of this? And I'm just talking about in the whole point of recovering, getting out of this COVID pandemic, where is there a recognition that there is enough of that this situation is aggravated and there's something drastic needed to be done?
I think there is recognition by different sectors. I think it's incorrect to say there isn't a recognition. There is a recognition, people are talking. But what I would like to say is that actually this has created for us an opportunity. The COVID,
Yeah.
because we have, kind of had to rework, rejig our thinking about what is work, how do we work, what's remote work. It has actually created an opportunity for us now to inject a gender lens purposefully into every aspect of recovery that we will take in the economic and the social sphere. Okay. For example, I think it's becoming very interesting that in many cases, remote working is not just the reality of COVID, but it may remain the reality post-COVID also. And we don't know when is post-COVID going to be honest. I mean, is post-COVID going to be 1 year from now? Is post-COVID going to be 2 years or 3 years from now or 3 months from now? We do not know. But what we do know is the use of technology, the ability to deliver in certain sectors on services and information, be it in healthcare, be it even in fitness and nutrition. I mean, you name it, there are multiple sectors in which remote working has become a reality. It is a possibility and a potential. And it will be exploited and positively, hopefully used in the economic recovery field. However, in this process, it also has to look at the fact that can we also bring women along in this new way of working and provide the kind of digital skills and capacity, the digital infrastructure that women generally don't have access to help them become a part of this new economic reality. And I think that rejigging is an opportunity for us. What is it that we need to do? And I think it's something which is pretty, certain things would be basic. Certain things would be to look at providing certain technical skills in sectors where healthcare related information, basic information related to, say, even, how to convene meetings or services can be done online now. Can we make that an opportunity for women? Because women would find it so much more easier to become a part of this process where they can manage what would be some of their traditional role, but also be gainfully economically employed. How do we then involve that? Otherwise, even that space will just largely get taken up and occupied by the male workforce.
So what you're saying, it's wonderful that you're saying it, because this could be an opportunity. But if we don't make use of the opportunity, we could actually slide backwards.
Yes. Yes, I think, and I think definitely, I think at every point, yes, it has been a difficult time for the world, but it's also a time which is, as a human race, we have rethought what our priorities are. We have learned and invented new ways of working, engaging, moving ahead. And I don't think we should let these learnings be lost. We should probably invest in them and make them a part of a more, more inclusive social and economic agenda going forward.
Yeah. Which sort of brings me to my last question. The role of media in this whole thing, how do you see, how do you think this what you just said about, we take the opportunity and it could be a new normal, which is a better normal, or we slide backwards? We actually go backwards in on the progress that we've made in the past. How can media help? And I mean, and where do you see media right now?
From my perspective, media also should really seize this opportunity to invest more on stories, on on discourses that talk about women's integration into this, and the gender equity issue into this whole social and economic going forward new normal, whatever you'd like to call it, process. And a lot of that would also be to push also policymakers, push our political leaders to start thinking about it in a more kind of serious, concerted manner. And do the necessary links and convenings, and do the necessary outreach that's there. And media can play a big role in that. Whether if you ask me whether it's playing it or not, I think currently the preoccupation is more on just the pandemic itself and its health hazard. But I would like to urge that I think the opportunity is now to talk about all of these concerns about how do we use this rejigging to create a more equitable economic and social structure. We are talking a lot about how do we use the new normal to create a more climate sensitive, environmentally safer, sustainable system, because we had seen the gains, the environmental and climate gains in COVID. So you're talking about that. It's the same thing. Why can't we also talk about how do we use this next stage of the world development, the global development, to be a more gender inclusive and equitable one? And I think those stories, those kind of narratives need to be focused a bit more by the media.
I can't but help asking you one very last question. I promise you this will be the last, which is in the last few weeks at the Asian Confluence, we've been talking to a lot of people, especially on these various multilateral the regional integration, regional cooperation platforms. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of demand across for multilateral cooperation on core issues. Issues such as agriculture, health, across boundaries, especially in the South Asian context, Eastern South Asian regional integration. I know that you work on that aspect. But again, I think the gender lens is absolutely missing in that entire narrative. And I say this because in the last 3 weeks, we've pretty much talked to every platform that exists, official and unofficial. And what can we do to bring this into the discourse? Because that, I think, is equally important, where we have, our Prime Minister very famously reached out to all the SAARC countries on the health aspect of COVID, and but I think gender equity, cooperation amongst the countries, sharing of experiences on what each country is doing, that is equally important to carry forward the importance of the narrative. Your comments on that?
I think unless gender is first is a key lens of operation for the economic and social recovery at the domestic level, it will not translate into the regional cooperation. So across our countries, the challenge is gender really a key lens for the social and economic recovery at our domestic levels? When it's absent in the domestic level, how do you expect it to be translated at a regional or a global level, right? It's also interesting to see that, when we talk about regional trade and TAF in particular, about our work, we have talked about women as being the core force for regional integration on trade, through the kind of agricultural products or through the kind of industrial product where women producers, women entrepreneurs take the lead. I feel that discourse has started picking up. We can't lose that.
Absolutely.
We still have to keep pushing for the fact that whether you are talking about integration internally or trade and economy internally, or we are talking beyond border, you cannot lose sight of the fact that majority of the producers at the primary end, at the lower end, are women. There are enough women who can take the leap from being a small producer to becoming a media and higher level entrepreneur. Just needs that right kind of support and impetus. It needs that right kind of policy framing. And we have to push for it. But it's also something, like I said, each of the South Asian countries first has to accept that as a critical part of its domestic recovery, it's going to place gender in the center. And that's when it will then become a mainstay of the regional space. Whereas in some countries, you actually see a lot, because I think in countries like Cambodia and all, where women are really fully recognized as within the SME sectors. And we are now in India pushing for the SME sectors. And clearly that is an area where, like I said, the stimulus packages, the SME packages should specifically lay out impetus, positive policies, norms that will support women. You have to spell that out so that you can encourage more women, and then work with stakeholders, civil society to bring these women out and help them do it. It may require a 2 to 10% extra investment, but I think it's worth it. It's really worth it, because that really will contribute to bringing this 50% plus of your workforce to be the major, push that is needed for the recovery. Otherwise, you will still be working with just about 50% of your workforce.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nandita, for sharing your perspectives. I think you you laid out such a holistic view of this very, very important issue, right from the household, a room in the house, all the way to regional cooperation, and it's so central to the discourse of recovery and the way forward. We of course must act and do things to take it forward, and this was a step in that direction. So in that, we hope that this we can do something more with you and to take this narrative forward. So on that note, again, thank you so much for joining on this edition of Expert Speak.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking to you, Satya.